All right, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Mina. I'm a systems engineer, senior advisor with Dell's user-centric solutions team. My primary focus is on the desktop space, the client space. And with me...
Hi, Mark Harrelson, systems engineer with Dell, enterprise tools, and primary focus is server OSD at the moment.
Yeah. So what we're going to focus on today is how we're doing OS management inside of Dell. OS management for client and server in a Fortune 50 company. A couple things that we want to go ahead and kind of set the expectations on as we're talking, because it's going to lend itself to the presentation. This is what we're doing here today. This is what we're doing in our environment. It may not meet the needs of your environment. Some things you may decide to use, some things you may not. So just keep that in mind. This isn't definitely the only way of doing things. Also key to bring up is that we are an extremely self-service environment. When we say self-service environment, a user in HR on Monday can come in and say, I've got an XP box. I want to move to Windows 7. We completely allow the business to go ahead. We empower them to go ahead and be able to bring down that image without any IT touch. So what do you have to do? And man, this is loud. So what do I have to do to go ahead and enable that? Three things specifically is what we're always keeping in the back of our head whenever we're imaging or creating a solution. First off, it's got to be intuitive, it's got to be informative, and we have to make sure we're protecting the end user environment. What do we mean by protecting the end user environment? Specifically, what we're saying is that we want to make sure that we're not going to put that user in a position where they trigger an image or something along those lines that's going to put them in peril. So we want to make sure that they're in an optimal state to go ahead and receive that image. So let's go ahead and dig in here. First thing we're going to talk about is your reference builds, or actually strategy. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Image strategy, these are just things you're going to have to go ahead and make decisions on before you take step one in creating a OSD task sequence. In our environment, we actually use one global image per OS and architecture globally. Definitely only want to have one image that you're going to have to maintain when you have a new package that you have to include. We have this saying that we use. We have one global image process that we use for all 150,000 of our clients, but we have 10,000 different outputs. We're going to show you a little bit how we actually go ahead and execute on that. Next thing is going to be your image release cycle. So inside on the client space, we have a 3-month or a quarterly release cycle that we provide new images to all of our clients. Pretty aggressive, but we are a tech company, so we have a lot of things that are introduced pretty quickly. So that 3-month release cycle really works well for us.
And we do the same thing on the server side. We actually have meetings with the server engineering team to just have a checkpoint and see if we're okay, and then go from there.
Yep. Next thing are the deployment methods. So we actually use 4 different deployment methods internally. We have the build is kicked off from Software Center, which is synonymous with RAP from 2007, which is of course with the operating system loaded. We have a bare metal build, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're using media to go ahead and boot back to your config manager environment and kick off the image process. We have what we call a remote media build, but you guys might know it as a full media build. Exactly, again, what it sounds like. We're actually putting the bits on a DVD and allowing that end user to completely build that system off the corporate wire. Then the fourth is what we call a factory build or a pre-stage build. This is, in essence, a method in which I, as a corporate customer, I've configured my task sequence in Config Manager, and I give that to my PC vendor, and I'm having them apply that in the factory. So I have zero, they're consuming my image, and I don't have to actually send that to a staging location. I can actually have it go from the factory directly over to that person in HR that ordered the system.
Yep. Not as many options in the server environment. We use the bare metal. And then for new sites that are coming up, we also have a remote media build, which we typically ship right now on an 8 gig USB.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is, what architectures are you going to support? So we actually offer 4 different images internally to Dell. We have an XP 32-bit, Win 7 32-bit, 64-bit, and we're now actually working with a Win 8 64-bit as well. We've completely dropped support for Vista at this point. When we were going through our Windows 7 deployment, what we really wanted to do was only offer a 64-bit operating system. 32-bit emulation was working well for us. A vast majority of the applications worked, but we ran into some issues where we actually had to offer both because we had one major line of business application that flat out just wouldn't work in a 32-bit emulation mode. So we actually had to offer both. But as we're moving forward with Windows 8, we're definitely, with the hardware standards that PC vendors are sending out, 4 gigs of memory, unless you're using a 64-bit operating system, you're not fully leveraging that memory space. So with Windows 8, we're definitely focusing on only offering a 64-bit.
Right, and in the server environment, we've pretty much standardized on 64-bit for all the 2K8 builds and 2K3. Unfortunately, we still have a 2K3 x86 build, though.
So let's talk a little bit about thin, thick versus a hybrid. So I think we all probably know the difference between a thin and a thick. Thin, just the operating system and patches. Thick, put everything underneath the kitchen sink in your image, capture that thing, and that's your image. And then you've got a hybrid scenario, and we're going to talk about that. We actually use a hybrid scenario inside. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see, a hybrid scenario. So what do we include in our image? So we mentioned that we have a 3-month release cycle for our image. So what we have a tendency to do is try to forecast the things that are going to likely not update over that 3-month period and put those into our image. Everything else, you're going to put those into a post. Examples of this, also large things that you would have as part of your image. Mm-hmm. Office, maybe an AV client. So as part of our image, we're actually going to go ahead and put, Office, Link, Live Meeting, AV client. Anything that doesn't rev often and it doesn't have a domain dependency towards the installation, we're going to go ahead and put into our image. Everything else goes in the post. Think of those things that do update more often than a 3-month period. Think of JRE. Think of Flash Player, Adobe Reader. These things rev all the time, and we want the manageability, so we want to make sure we're going to go ahead and put those in our post action.
And it's the same on the server side. I mean, we run pretty light. We put the AV client. For the 2K3 stuff, we go ahead and install .NET and install PowerShell.
In fact, I'll tell you what, why don't we just go ahead and take a look at one of our reference builds real fast. We'll come back and we'll talk about the boot images here in a second. So here's an example of our reference build that we're using internally. We do use Config Manager for both our image distro and also for creating our reference builds. Lots of pros and cons in relation to this. Some people like to use an MDT environment. The only reason why we really decided to move forward with Config Manager is just because I don't want to have to maintain different packages in 2 different environments. If I've got a JRE package, I want to be able to leverage that from my Config Manager environment. Nothing earth-shattering here. You see we've got, our basic OS installation steps, some of those core pieces that we're going to put into our image. It's just in our build process. Coming up with this scripted build process really helps you out in relation to, when you do have a quarterly update. I mean, we have what we call a set it and forget it scenario here. I mean, when something new comes out, I need to include a new version of Silverlight or something. I can just go into my task sequence, put it in, kick off my reference build process. I come back a couple hours later and my image is captured and it's ready to be sent out to the DPs.
Yeah, it's very nice. And on the server side, we actually respin our 2K3 builds every month. So this speeds things up.
Let's come back over and talk a little bit about your boot images. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about, boot images in a reference build versus your corporate image. So typically if you're going to be doing a scripted build, which is what we do internally every 3 months, you have to have a separate boot image per architecture for those images that you're going to provide. If you're going to have a 32-bit Win7 reference build, you need to have a 32-bit WinPE environment that you're going to go ahead and leverage. Not so much the same when you're deploying an image. Keep in mind that only is true when you are using a scripted install. You are using an install package scenario. If you actually, and this is actually what we're doing with Windows 8, is you could go ahead and create an image package by referencing the install.wim that comes with the Microsoft Media and actually go ahead and use that for your reference build. In that scenario, you can use one boot image per different R architecture without a problem. Really working well for us with the Win 8 stuff, so I think that's probably where we're going to be moving things to in the future.
We're doing that for Server 8 also.
Yeah. Next thing is default packages. What are default packages? Default packages, what we have, since we're more on the engineering side, we want to make those task sequences as, labor intense. We don't want to be going back in there and doing a lot of updates. So what we do is we work with our operations teams that we have let's use JRE for instance. We've got a JRE package, and we may have 7, 15 different programs in that package, but we only have one default program. That default program is our Dell standard. So what that allows us to do is when my operations guys decide they're going to go from 160.32 to 1.7, all they have to do is just go ahead and change the command line in that program, and my task sequence is automatically going to go ahead and consume that, and it's going to get that latest version. And of course, the last step, this is probably a common sense, but build these things in VMs. Take the drivers out of the equation. You'll have plenty of time to deal with drivers when you're working on your corporate image. We actually use a Hyper-V environment to build up our reference builds, but it's definitely going to take a lot of the complexity out of the equation. All right, drivers, everyone's favorite subject. So drivers, we actually use only 2 driver packages for our Windows 7 and, well, soon to be Windows 8 internally. We have a laptop driver package and a desktop driver package. Some environments like to use, a specific driver package per model. Really, that's just all going to tie back into how many models you guys are going to be supporting. Internally, we support about 60 plus corporate class systems with our drivers. So in order to get rid of a lot of the duplication that you may have in, for instance, let's say a latitude line, you may have the same video driver between several different models. Being able to go ahead and rationalize that driver package, get rid of the duplicates, and apply those really saves us time and space. Let's talk a little bit about raw drivers versus drivers with applications. What does this mean? So we all know Config Manager only brings in raw drivers. Which is great, for a vast majority of your devices. But what do you do for those scenarios where maybe you're using a broadband card or Bluetooth? Especially on the broadband side, these are things that you need to be able to connect back into your corporate network. So you want to make sure that you're including that as part of your image process. And what we'll show here in a minute is being able to leverage the WMI checks as part of a task sequence to go ahead and install that. We'll take a look at that here in a second. One of the cool new things with Config Manager 2012 is this idea of single instance storage. I'm sure a lot of you guys are already aware of this, but it's in essence allowing you to go ahead and make sure you don't have duplicates of content out on your DPs. In essence, you could go ahead and, when you're creating a driver package, point over to a parent folder. It's going to traverse that, import all those drivers, and not make sure that it's bringing in the same driver more than once. This is kind of a cursing and a blessing. So I didn't mention, I kind of skimmed over it. You've got the apply driver package, and then you've got the auto apply drivers. Apply is saying, hey, here's a set of drivers, go and apply this to the operating system, or not to the operating system, to the driver store before mini setup runs, and consume that as part of the mini setup process. The other process is, hey, I've got the whole bucket of drivers here, do verification and determine what drivers I'm going to install. We actually use the apply driver package. In fact, specifically in 2007, we would use a empty driver package. You create a driver package, it's pointed over to this location, it's completely empty, and then I can go ahead and put whatever I want into it, send it out to my DPs, and then as part of my mini setup stage, it's going to go ahead and apply those to the store for a P&P scenario. For that reason, it's kind of a curse for us because we do have to, with Config Manager 2012, you do have to import all of your drivers. There's no way around it. The blessing, though, is that rationalization of those drivers that we used to have to do in the past, we no longer have to do. I point over to a parent folder. It's automatically going to go ahead and traverse each child folder, look for drivers, and import those into my driver.
It's going to save a lot of space on your distribution servers.
Exactly. The last piece I want to talk about in drivers is this really cool script that a coworker of ours, Greg Ramsey, wrote. It's called Import Custom Drivers. What this allows you to do is, in your production task sequence, have a step that looks for a condition, and if it finds it, it's going to go ahead and dynamically inject those drivers into your driver store. Let me give you a scenario. So 60-plus models that we support internally, but I've got an executive that went out and bought a consumer class system, and he wants to use that as his corporate box. What we can do is we've actually got this script that's built into our task sequence that is looking for any drive with an exported drivers folder in it. If it finds it, it's going to traverse every folder and subfolder looking for drivers, and ejecting that into the store as part of my image process. Also works great for testing. Think about, I've got a new laptop line that's coming out, and I want to be able to quickly test, and I don't want to have to create a driver package, send it out to the DPs, clone my task sequence, reference this driver package. I can now quickly go ahead and take those drivers, put it on the USB, and consume it as part of my imaging process. Just keep in mind that this process only works with Windows Vista and above. You don't have that DISM functionality with XP. Do we want to? Yeah, I think we're going to go back to boot. Variables. Okay, so we talk about we have one global image process, but you have 10,000 outputs. How do you do it? It's with the variables. So we all know the variables that are built into Config Manager. You've got WMI variables. You've got OS checks. You can a myriad of different things, but what we like to do is actually break them down by use case. What types of things are you going to use in a task sequence to execute on what you need to do? So we've got 4 different types. In fact, we're probably just going to come over to the console and we'll talk about each one. First type we're going to look at is going to be a build variable. Take a drink of water. Wow. So we see here a build variable is in essence just a, when I'm doing a remote media build or a bare metal build, or I kick something off from Config Manager, I may want to go ahead and execute certain steps or not execute steps. So I can actually go ahead and use the built-in variable for, what is it, SMS TS client, or wait a minute, that's the wrong step. Where am I here? Let's go to our production. That's our issue.
There's the reference build.
Yep, don't want our reference build. Let's scroll up here and look at this disk part command. So we see examples here of steps that we decide to run or not run in our task sequence. In this scenario, we know that if we've launched this image from Software Center or we're doing a OEM pre-stage, we don't want to run this step. Of course, you can see how you could use the same thing in relation to your remote media builds or your bare metal scenario. For maybe your remote media build is, okay, I went ahead and I triggered from a full media scenario. I'm going to put my remote domain join package on the client as part of that image process. Next type is going to be, in fact, let me get back here to my notes here because I want to make sure I cover because we got a lot to cover here, is going to be the model-specific things. Now, I'm sure any of you guys that are probably using OSD today are probably using some type of model check. In essence, this is just a WMI conditional. Let's take a look at one. Scroll over here a little bit so we can see it. So yeah, I mean, in essence, what we're doing is just querying WMI, pulling the Win32 computer system.model, and if it contains these values, then I'm going to go ahead and apply a specific driver package. This is what allows us to go ahead and use those 2 driver packages for our laptops and desktops and apply the appropriate one.
Just going to mention right here, we also leverage chassis type on the server side. There are certain instances where you want to install something on real hardware, but you don't want to install on a VM. So we use, like in our case, it would be a Power Edge. If it's a Power Edge, then you do this. If it's not, then you don't do that.
Next one is what we call an error handling variable. Imagine a scenario where, in fact, this is kind of a little bit different between the client and server space. I'll tell you how we do it on the client space first, but let's say that in my task sequence, a vast majority of the things that I have in there, I don't care if something failed. If this build didn't get the latest version of Flash Player, for instance, or Reader, I'd much rather go ahead and remediate those things after the fact. But there are steps in my post-action that I do care about. What types of things? Think of scenarios where you've got something that allows connectivity back into your network, like a remote access, your VPN solution. Those things that if they do fail, I want to make sure I'm capturing that. I'm still allowing the task sequence to go ahead and continue on with the next step and get a more complete build, but I want to know if those specific task sequence steps failed. So in essence, we'll see an example of this here. We have our remote access solution that we're installing. The next step is just going to do a check of the previous step that we ran, and this is a built-in variable to Config Manager. Just check the SMS last action return code, and if it's a failure, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to execute this step, which in essence creates a task sequence variable called critical fail. critical fail exists, it's going to go ahead and continue on with the task sequence. But as I get down here towards the end, I've got my gather logs here, and it's got the same lookup. If I see that the critical fail is equal to false or true, we're going to go ahead and run these steps. In essence, what we do here is we copy the SMSTS logs up to a network location. We're going to go ahead and do a send mail, which is just a, part of any of the script packs, but just send an email over to maybe the engineer or our service desk guys to let them know that, yes, this build failed. We're probably going to have to go back and do some remediation.
Yeah, and on the server side, we're a little more rigid. If we have an error, we fail the build right there. Take a look at the logs, remediate the issue, and basically re-image the box. We need every server to be in that standard configuration so that it'll pass the pre-production audits.
Yep. And the fourth type that we have is what we call a hardware specific. We mentioned that scenario where we can apply a raw driver as part of our applied driver package, but what do we do for those scenarios where we have the mobile broadband card that has application and driver? Especially for those things that allow connectivity back into the network, we need to make sure that we're addressing those as part of our task sequence. So here we'll see an example of what we're doing with those types of things. So we have as part of our task sequence, we always have a broadband installation step. And what you can do is, this is again just a WMI query looking for Win32 PNP entity. And if I see this PNP identity, I know that this device is installed, and I want to go ahead and install the driver and the connection manager software. You could use the same scenario for things like Bluetooth, anything that would actually require both. Definitely something that we heavily leverage internally to get both those applications and drivers. Did I miss anything, Mark? I think I got it all.
I think so.
All right, let's go back to the slide. Let's go to the next one. We just did the driver package demo, so let's get past this. So let's go on to boot images. What do we do for boot images? So we mentioned that we use in a reference build, we have to have one boot image per OS and actually one boot image per architecture for doing our reference builds, but not so much when you're doing your corporate image. In fact, we use a WinPE 30 32-bit image for both of our 64-bit and our 32-bit images. Since you're actually applying an image, you can use one boot image for all your OSs. So when we have a bare metal build, it's all one ISO. You don't have to decide what ISO based off of the operating system you're planning on laying down. Other thing, if you're going to be using scripts as part of your boot image, which we're going to show a couple of those here in a second, you need to make sure that you're adding support in your boot image for those things. Things like WMI, HTA support, scripting support, MDAC support. These are all packages that you need to make sure that you're applying to your boot image if you want to be able to use those tool sets. Drivers. I can't put it any other way. Just keep it simple in relation to your drivers. We see, we talk with a lot of customers and where they'll try to go ahead and put a mass storage and a NIC driver for every model that they support. Oftentimes, the drivers that are built into the WinPE environment are going to work, or you've got drivers that are already in there that are going to work across a myriad of different models. For instance, we have 60 models that we support inside. We have less than 10 drivers that we put into our boot images, and a lot of those are really one-off devices like USB NICs or USB 3.0 drivers. Yeah, I mean, you don't really need to go crazy. You can also use your F8 support to determine whether or not you have access to the file system or access to the network. But definitely want to keep it simple just so you don't have to go back there and update a lot of drivers.
Right. And on the server side, we support about 20-plus models internally, and we have probably at about around 5, maybe a little bit more, and mainly those are mass storage on the server side. Yeah.
A new functionality with Config Manager 2012 is this method in which you can go ahead and create a package and have it automatically just go ahead and create a share. So previously with 2007, when we had our bare metal disks and our remote media disks, we actually had to go out, create a share on each of our Config Manager servers, stage this stuff out, and it was a pretty manual, laborious process. They've got a new functionality built into the package properties in Config Manager 2012 that allows you to go ahead and copy the content directly over to that to a share. And like in this instance, we have an images $share, and that content will automatically go ahead and get shipped out. It just makes it a little bit easier, a lot less steps that we have to getting our ISOs out to each one of our config manager servers. And of course, why do you want to do that? Well, I don't want to have someone from Malaysia come all the way back to Austin to go ahead and pull an ISO. I want that on that local server to save the WAN. And one last thing, don't forget your USB 3.0 drivers. So Win 7, WinPE 3.0, they have no native support for USB 3.0, and a lot more devices are now coming with USB 3.0. So if you're going to be using USB flash drives to kick off your image process, or maybe an optical drive that's external, you're going to want to make sure that you include that as part of your boot image. In fact, you know what? Let's come over and take a quick look at a boot image. So it's got one more thing that I want to talk about. Sure, a lot of you guys are probably aware that they've got a new functionality in 2012 with your boot image, allowing to reference a network location and include everything that's in that network location in the payload for your WinPE environment. We see here that we've got a include files for pre-start command. I can put whatever I want in that folder, and it's automatically going to be included in the payload. Think of things, even though it's included in the boot image, but like CM trace. Maybe I've got a custom HTA, like in this scenario, or any other tool, maybe something to modify the BIOS. You can actually go ahead and put those into your environment without actually having to go back to the old school way that we had with 2007 of taking the boot WIM, mounting it, putting it down in the file system, committing it, unmounting it, and then sending it out. They've made it a lot easier.
It's nice.
And we've also got the step here where we can enable a pre-start command. This is, in essence, a command that's going to be triggered at the beginning of the boot process. So before I even see an OS selection screen, it's going to go ahead and trigger this HTA. You see it's actually putting over to a specific location. This functionality that's built into the console is always going to put these files into this X, SMS, PKG, SMS 10,000 folder. The key and the reason why I bring this up is there is no mapping that you have in that boot environment that will allow you to go directly over. So if you're going to be running a script, you want to make sure that you're putting the full path in. If I couldn't just go ahead and call unknown systems.hta, I have to have the full path. Keep that in mind too, that if you're trying to launch CM trace or something, you actually have to navigate to that path. I think that's all I have on boot image. Let's come back here to the PowerPoint. All right, pre-executions and pre-qualifications. So this is an example of what we use internally for our bare metal builds, our remote media builds, and our factory builds. The example on the left is what we call a pre-execution. End user comes up, they select their location, and it's going to set what we call the big three. The big three variables that are going to allow my task sequence to complete. They select Austin, it's going to go ahead and set their domain name, their domain OU name, and their time zone. You can also do specific types of things, and like in our environment, in our pre-execution, on some of our systems we have a third-party disk encryption solution that doesn't allow access to the file system in a WinPE environment in an unattended fashion. You know, if I actually provided a PIN and so on, I could get access to the file system, but it's not something that I can build into a process. So we can actually go ahead and determine whether or not that disk is encrypted. If so, maybe just do a disk part clean as part of that process. Why is that important? Well, keep in mind that in those scenarios where your task sequence and your media have a different boot image or a different boot image version, it's going to go ahead and try to pre-stage that boot image down on the box before the task sequence starts and it kicks off the disk part. So this was something that we actually had to go ahead and put in to make sure that if we found those disk encrypted boxes, that we run the disk part to destroy the file system. Example on the right is what you would get, what we call a pre-qualification. This is what you would get when you go into Software Center and you kick off your Win 7 image. It's going to go ahead and surface this. This is what we talk about being able to protect that end user experience and make sure that they're not triggering an image when they're in a non-optimal scenario. You see we've got specific things here like making sure, for a Windows 7 image, you've got 2 gigs of memory, maybe 20 gigs of free drive space if I want to run a user state migration. Also checking for things like roaming profiles. If anyone uses roaming profiles, you probably know you don't want users in one location roaming between different operating systems. It's going to mess with the roaming profile, so we check for that. And if they are a roaming profile, they need to get in touch with the tech to go ahead and kick off their imaging process. And then, of course, a check for, making sure you're not kicking off the image when you're in a wireless or over a remote access connection. So if any of these things fail, it's going to go ahead and message the user, stop the task sequence, and they would have to go back and remediate those steps before they move forward. Another piece that we have here that we don't currently leverage, we did at one time, but doing a system model check. Maybe I only want this operating system to install on these specific models. You could easily go ahead and do the check for that. If it fails, go ahead and kill the task sequence. A couple other things that we include with ours is the ability for the user to go ahead and skip the user state migration. In some scenarios, just because they kicked the build off from Software Center, they may not want all the data. They may want that quick imaging process. So we allow them the ability to go ahead and select the option to go ahead and skip the USMT. And then this other piece is really important. We have a link here for our application compatibility list. So this allows the end user, before they kick off that image process, to go in, check to see what applications are compliant with the Windows 7 64-bit build, and if their application is on that list, allows them to go ahead and cancel out of the task sequence before moving on to the new operating system.
Talk a little bit about the server space. This is our standard HTA that pops up when we image a box. One of the first things that we do when we do this, we have to make sure that we have network connectivity. So what we try and do is we try and get out on a DHCP address. If we get that, great. If not, then we pop up a dialog box and say, hey, you're going to have to enter a static IP. So you go ahead and enter your static IP information, hit validate IP. We have a script that actually goes down and enumerates through the NICs, and it sets that IP information on each NIC and tries to get out. If it can ping our management point, we're good. If it doesn't, it clears that one, goes to the next one, and we keep trying until we hit one where we can actually get out. So once you've got network connectivity, then you can look. We have some WMI queries where we actually pull some information for the server engineer. Anything in yellow is user changeable, so they can go ahead and put in their production name. They can join the domain. There's a drop-down list. They pick that. They can see the list of disks that they have. There's also a selection there for the 50 gig system partition. Some of the blades, they just have one drive, so we need to make sure that we set that variable so we only partition a 50 gig and then leave the rest for the application. They also select the location that they're imaging from, and when they do that, it goes ahead and pre-populates the DNS and WINS entries, and it also sets the OU that the server is going to join. Another drop-down is the admin group. We have a lot of people that work in labs, and in our standard build, they don't have access to log on to them. So they pick the lab group that they're in, it adds it to the local admin group, and they're able to log on, do their testing, and such. After that, we have a time zone. They can select that based on their location. And something that's not actually shown here, but we have some application servers that they came to us. They had a list of about 5 applications that they always installed, various tools that they use with this application. And so we went ahead and packaged those up, and they just click the box if that's the type of server that they're imaging. And then during the image process, it reads that variable, and if it's true, then it goes ahead and installs those applications as part of the process. And another thing, this is good also for troubleshooting. If you're looking at your disk and you don't have any, you probably have a driver problem. You can also, F8 here and check your IPs and make sure you have your NIC set. I think that's about it.
Okay. So we've mentioned what we do today with the client and server space in relation to pre-execution, pre-qualifications. I want to talk briefly about where we're moving. So in essence, Mark and I have had to create these HTAs as part of our imaging process out of necessity. There were specific things that we needed to do that just flat out weren't built into the tool. I think a lot of us know that let me take a step back here. Let me mention too that we also use the MDT extensions within our config manager. Not only for the UDI and some BG info that we're going to cover, but also just having that deploy route package that we can go ahead and reference scripts from. But in this scenario, we're actually making the move from maintaining our HTAs over to this user-driven installation that's included with MDT 2012. Reason being is we believe now it's at that point where it's mature enough that it's going to give us the flexibility that we need and give us the benefit of quickly being able to go in and making a modification to an XML file without having to go in and do the scripting in the HTA. I think we're going to go through let's go through a quick demo of what we're looking at today. So any of you guys that have looked at the UDI, lots of different UIs that are available with the tool. Some of them in our environment provide value, some of them don't. You know, things that don't really provide value in our environment, things like configuring the TPM or setting the machine name or allowing a end user to add a group or a user into the local administrator group. These are all things that we're going to control on the back end, so we want to go ahead and hide those things. And the UDI wizard allows us to go ahead and do those types of things. This is the UDI wizard that comes with MDT 2012. Here's an example of a scenario that we're working to implement today. The other thing I didn't mention, so we've got things that we definitely don't want to use in our managed environment. There are other things that are maybe optional. Think of things like your summary screen, excuse me, your summary screen or your welcome screen. Really, you just need to make a decision in relation to how informed you want to make the user versus how many clicks you want that user to go through before kicking off that image process. We've also got a preview that allows you to go through these UIs to make sure you understand what the user experience is without actually having to put it into a task sequence and run through that whole scenario. Just makes it easier to go ahead and test. So here's an example. You know, we've got a basic welcome screen. We can do those checks like we were doing in our pre-qualification. You know, I want to check disk encryption. I want to make sure that you have 2 gigs of free memory. You can go ahead and use the built-in conditionals that they have with the tool set, but you can also include your own script. Very basic, very easy. In fact, we've already got a lot of the code since it's already in our HTA. Let's move on. This one is key too. We see that we've got our different domains and our OUs, much like what we had with our pre-execution. I can go ahead and select a specific domains, select a specific location, and it's going to put that PC in that domain and OU. You see that the computer name is grayed out. Reason why it's grayed out is we've locked that control. We already have a naming standard that we're going to apply to our clients. So I'm going to go ahead and show them what the computer name is going to be named. But in essence, we don't allow them the ability to go ahead and change that because we want to make sure that they're adhering to the standard. Another key piece with this UI is you notice that it's got the pieces down there for username and password. In the UDI for MDT 2012, they allow you to set a variable that you can use to store the values for each of these. Honestly, though, it's not necessary. If you're using OSD for your imaging, you can use the credentials that you put in the apply network setting, and it's automatically going to use those credentials to join the domain, but it'll use the values that you selected here for the domain and OU to add the PC to the domain. So definitely keep that in mind. Makes it a little bit easier for us to go ahead and manage. Next screen is user device affinity. Being able to go ahead and say, yes, you know what, this is Chris minus PC. So we can go back and use that for software distribution, or maybe end of life. I want to know what Chris minus primary laptop is. So being able to store that in your config manager database. Next one is pretty basic, same thing that we had before. Being able to set your keyboard layout, your time zone, based off of what the user wants to set. I mean, this is really great too because now it's not tied to a specific location. I can set a keyboard layout based off of the hardware platform, but maybe I'm in Austin, but I'm based in Malaysia. I want to set my time to a Malaysian time zone. So it just gives you a little bit more of the flexibility that we're looking for. This next piece, I thought I actually had some software titles in, but I don't. But in essence, this is your optional software. This is going to be what allows you to select applications that may not be as part of your standard image that you want to include. Let me give you a couple of scenarios. In fact, let me give you a use case even better. So we approached our business a while ago and said, you know what, we've got this imaging process. We know what location we're going to be adding these PCs to. So let's say if a user selects Paris, France, we'll just go ahead and install the French buoy pack. Turned out the response we got back from our business is, well, we would prefer you not go ahead and enforce A MUI, we may have people that prefer English or prefer a different language. We would much rather have that as self-service through the Software Center. This allows us to actually, instead of actually having a separate step where we have to image the box and go into Software Center and install a MUI, they can actually just do it as one process. So they can install a MUI or any other tool set. Think also, of those role-based install types. I'm in marketing, I'm in sales. I want to get these applications. You can go ahead and select those specific applications, and it's automatically going to install those as part of your image process. Just keep in mind that this isn't going to work in those remote media build or pre-stage factory scenarios because you don't have access to your infrastructure. And I think that's pretty much it on UDI.
Okay, and on the server side, the server deployment team, the feedback I've gotten is they don't want to click through all these screens. They'd rather keep the HTA, have one single pane, they can look, do everything there, and continue on. If at some point where the UDI was easy to customize and we could put everything that we needed, on one pane, then it's probably something we'll look at.
Yep.
One of the things that we do, we use BG-Info to display certain status messages in the background during the progress of the install. There's about 4 phases. It's just a quick way for the engineer to determine the status on where the build is. We have an image install, set up windows, post install, and then at the end it's going to be a success or failure. And I think we've got a little...
we want to go next?
Yeah, we'll do that. So this is an example of our success and failure screens. If it's successful, there's some information about the server, but we also pop up this dialog box that says the image completed successfully, and that's going to be persistent. It's going to stay up there. Our guys, they image multiple servers all over the place, and a lot of times it'll come back, if it completes successfully, to be back at a Control-Alt-Delete screen, and they don't know exactly what happened, if it's good or not. And the same with the failure. If it fails, we want them to know that, so it's going to sit right there until they actually click on it, and then we'll investigate, what the failure is at that point.
Yeah, because often those scenarios, a person isn't actually sitting in front of the box when you get the failure, and if you don't change the timeout time, chances are if they're not sitting in front of it 30 minutes, or is it 30 minutes, whatever it is, bottom line, they may miss it. They may not know that the build actually failed. This is really critical because of audit items in our server space to let that engineer know that that build actually failed and missed a specific step. You want to do the next?
Yep.
All right, patch updates that are built into Config Manager 2012. So a lot of us probably know we can use DISM to go ahead and apply OS patches to our images offline without actually having to go ahead and respin the image. They've got a cool new feature built into Config Manager 2012 that takes all that command line steps and they build it directly into the console.
Very nice.
So imagine, I've got an image and I decide that, Patch Tuesday just came out. I've got these patches. I want to go ahead and apply that. I can go directly into the console, do a right click, select the patches that I want to apply, and it'll go ahead and install them into my image and send it out to the DPs. In fact, you know what?
And you can schedule that.
Yes, and you can schedule it. So that's key. We all know that if we make an update to an image, chances are we probably don't want to do that at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, because if you kick off an update of that image package, every build that you kick off is going to fail until that image makes it out to the distribution point that that person is building from. Yeah. So by being able to go ahead and schedule this, it's Friday afternoon, I'm going to go ahead and schedule this for 2 a.m. on Saturday or Sunday. That's going to make sure that, yes, it's executing what I want, but when I want to do it for, maybe a maintenance window scenario.
Right. That's great in the server environment. We can set up a maintenance window for image servicing, send out an email, and tell everybody at this point in time, images is not going to be available until we get this completed.
Excuse me?
You mentioned Malaysia earlier.
Yes?
How long does it take for your image to get to Malaysia?
So the question was, how long does it take for us to go ahead and distribute our content to the Malaysia server? It really depends. Malaysia, we actually have a pretty good pipe to. I'd probably say image, probably around 4 hours. So it's going to take a bit of time. I think probably 4 to 6 hours is probably our sweet time. That's when I can go back into the console and I can typically look at the status and 95% of my DPs have been updated by that point.
Of course, if you have some more remote locations, it's going to take a little longer to trickle those down.
Yeah, there's only so much liquid you can get through a straw, and that's really what it's going to be tied back to. So let's come in here. So here we see just the scheduled updates. Right-click on that image. If we actually had the catalog installed on this, we would see those patches that we wanted to apply. You can filter it by a 32-bit operating system, a 64-bit operating system, or all. Select those images or select those patches, and the console does the rest. Little gotcha that we found with this, though. While the process works great and you're going to get a message as soon as it's started that process, it's still doing a lot of stuff in the background. And like we mentioned, in order to get those out to the DPs, that takes quite a bit of time. So you definitely want to make sure that after you kick this process off, you're coming in and you're checking your console here. Let me cancel this guy. There's a little scheduled update status. That's going to let you know where it's at in the process. Because, I mean, in essence, it's doing the same thing that we would do manually. DIS them, mount the WIM, apply the patches, unmount it, commit it, and then send it out to the DPs. You just want to make sure that you're watching this and updating, hitting your F5 to refresh your image package just to know what step you're in this process. And I think we mentioned schedule, so I think that's everything we have on that. Let's go back over to the PowerPoint.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about this Linux CentOS build, and you can get my task sequence up here in a minute. So let me kind of set the stage for this. In our environment, we actually have a separate Linux team that they do their own image installation. They have their own infrastructure, web servers, all that stuff. But our server deployment team, they actually install Linux also in addition to the Windows OSs. So they came to us with an ask. They wanted to use the config manager process to kick off a Linux build. And that way it would reduce, would be down to a single boot ISO that they could use worldwide. And so we said, okay, we'll look at that. We weren't real sure how we were going to do this. But what we needed to do was understand their process. The Linux team had a USB boot. They'd stick in the system, boot it up, and it would present the engineer with a menu. And they selected the region on wherever they wanted to install. They had web servers in Americas, Europe, and Malaysia. So they would pick the region, and then they would pick the version of, in this case it was Ubuntu, that they wanted to install. And then they would start that process. So that's how they were doing it. And so what we needed to do was kind of capture that boot process that they had and move it into Config Manager. And we did that through a package and creating a task sequence that we then deployed to a collection, which we had a system injected into that collection so it would be able to see that task sequence. And I'm going to go through some of the requirements, the needed files, kind of the install process flow chart, the task sequence. We'll do a little demo, and then IIS setup. So
yeah, and the disclaimer is this process isn't officially supported by Microsoft. But just keep in mind, I think you'll see as we're going through this, it's very, while this is a one-stop shop for all of your server imaging scenarios, it's very little that you're actually doing inside the config manager client, or the console. Do we want to go over to the?
Yep.
Okay.
I actually want to go to the next one. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're going to go through the needed files real quick. Okay, of course you're going to need your source ISO. When you have that, you need to mount it and copy all the files to your a location on your, in this case, our web server. And you can use 7-zip or a Linux-friendly ISO tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You'll also have your Kickstart config file in that same location. And then what we did for our config manager package, these were the contents that we needed to make this thing work. We had a bunch of syslinux files, which is actually the bootloader file. The config file, which actually sets up the RAM disk. It points to the KS config file on the HTTP server, sets the port. In this case, we're using port 8080. And it also sets a RAM disk. And then we have some menu files, and then the image files, and of course then we need the web server. But this is the config manager package that we actually send out, and we'll reference that in the task sequence.
And those config files are just pretty much an answer file
Right.
for that Linux environment?
Right.
Okay.
So let's go
Want to go to this
here.
guy?
Yep. We'll take a look at the task sequence real quick.
I'll switch the spots.
Okay, thanks. So this is our task sequence that we're using to kick this thing off. And actually, it's a little shorter than this because I don't actually, in production, I don't run this disk part. I just did that for the demo since I was rebuilding the box every time. But the first thing that we're doing, we're going to format and partition the drive. We need to create a FAT32 file system, and in this case, we're doing a 500 meg partition. And then we come down and we copy all the source files, which were basically the ones that I had talked about earlier. We just do an X copy and put them in the C drive. And then we come down to setting the bootloader parameters at this point. So there's some command lines here, or switches. So this -M, we set the, it's the master boot record, and then the -A, we make it active. -F is we force it, and -D is the destination of the syslinux config file. We just have to point to it. And then within the syslinux config file, it's going to point to the KS config and the web server, like I said. So what's going to happen is we need a reboot after this. And then when we reboot, the bootloader is going to be active. It's going to run syslinux config and bring up the menu that they're used to seeing, which they could pick their version of Linux or whatever it is on there. And then once that runs, it's going to contact the web server, pull the KS files, and run the install from that. We had a little bit of an issue with just doing a reboot because at this point, when we set the syslinux bootloader, in your reboot step, you can reboot to an OS. Well, we didn't have one. Or you could reboot back to the boot image. Well, we didn't have a valid one at that point. So the X drive is still available, so we went into Windows System 32 when we ran the WinPE util and then did the reboot flag on it. And so we could cleanly exit out of this task sequence. If you tried one of the other ones, it would throw up an error, and you would be failed at that point. It would say, error task sequence, couldn't do this, and you were hosed at that point. So with this method, we actually exit out of the task sequence, and at this point, we're through with Config Manager. Its job is done. It's got everything down. It's set the bootloader, and at this point, it's all up to the syslinux stuff. So let's go over to the demo.
So we're going to go ahead and kick one of these off right now?
Yeah, this is one that finished earlier when we were running through this, so we'll go ahead and start this process. We'll do a reset.
And at this point, we're just going to be booting to our standard config manager boot,
Right,
boot ISO.
right. This is a standard process that they would use to deploy Windows or Linux.
Let's give it a quick second to load.
When this thing starts building, I want to talk a little bit about the IIS setup. In our production environment, I didn't have to worry about that, but for the purposes of the demo, I had to set up a website and configure it, and there were a few little gotchas there, and we can go through those. So we're just going to go next right here. And this actually isn't our production HTA. This is something I actually borrowed from Chris. It's actually throwing a computer resource into our collection, and then we have our task sequence, our CentOS task sequence deployed to that collection. So once it's in there, it'll query policy and see what's available to it. And I'm actually not even going to do this because I know it's in there. So we'll close out this to see what kind of policy we have. And there's our build. So at this point in production, what they would see our Ubuntu build, the different flavors, and then they would also see our Windows OS builds at this point, and they could pick whichever one they wanted to do.
Standard OS selection screen.
Right. And so we're going to say next. And we're going to start running the task sequence at this point. And we'll watch this for a minute till we get through with the config manager part and make sure the build actually starts.
The Linux kernel is actually triggered.
Right.
Okay. Should be quick. There's only a couple of steps. There's our boot.
And this is the menu that they see. In production, of course, they would have their regions and then their different versions that they could pick from. So in this case, we only have one, so we're going to go ahead and kick that off. We'll watch this move for a minute.
Okay.
All right, setting up the Ethernet. And it was really sweet with Hyper-V. I actually had to do nothing to configure anything on the Hyper-V client. It just magically all worked out of the box. So that was really nice. Yeah, let's flip back over to the PowerPoint. I'm going to talk a minute about the... we actually went through that already. Let's see. I think we still need to go through it. I think I talked to it already.
Okay.
So we want to go to the IIS setup.
Is it a previous slide?
Should be after that.
Okay.
Keep going.
Keep going?
The other way, yeah.
I'm going.
Maybe it's not on the one we uploaded.
Perhaps.
There we go. Okay, no, that isn't it. Yes, it is. Okay, so what I had to do here, I had to create a new website on the, I actually did it on the config manager site that we have running here. Set the port to 8080. You have to enable directory browsing, and you can confirm that. There's a little hyperlink over there. You can browse. And then you're able to see all the files that you mounted and copied over to that source location, along with your Kickstart file. And then you had to add these mem types. I knew nothing about this when I started, but I found out fairly quickly that you have to have these. So you have to have all these extensions added, and then you also have to enable the double escape character to equal true to make all this stuff work. When I first started, let's go back over. No, actually, let me just go to the next one. When I first started and set it all up, you know, it kicked off, started working, but it tried to actually go look for the KS config file.
Give me a second.
Okay. There we go. And this popped up. I went, whoa, what is this? And it's pretty self-explanatory. It didn't have this KFC file, wasn't defined in my mem map. So I had to go in there and define that, like in the previous slide showed, all those different types that you have to do. Of course, I thought I had them all in there, but I didn't. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll show you another error message you'll get if you don't have that in there. For the RPMs, it'll come up with this error message if that's not defined in there. And then I got another kind of weird error that I'll show you. And this one was kind of weird. You know, it said it failed, and I could actually browse to that location and see that file. And it took me a little while to figure out what it was. But when I mounted my boot ISO, my boot source, I used virtual clone drive. I mounted it, copied it over there, and it looked good. But then I got to looking at the boot after it was mounted from my Linux expert. He was helping me look at it, and he goes, "There's no file extensions on the one that you have." So it turns out that virtual clone drive was not Linux friendly. So you need to use something like 7-zip or something that's Linux friendly to get those. And at that point, you might want to flip back to the build, and we'll see how it's going. And we're still going. We're installing the packages now, so the build is on the way. We still got a little ways to go, but that's what we did to satisfy that request from the server team. So now they have a standard way to install those Windows and Linux builds, and they only have to have that one boot ISO, which they could use USB, or they can use virtual media to attach that if they have remote access controllers. So they're pretty happy with it.
And it's that one-stop shop.
Right.
So let's move on to migration. Migration over from 2007 to 2012, and some of the things that we found in relation to OS that caused us issues, or just things that you want to keep in the back of your head. First off, we mentioned that we do use the MDT extensions in our task sequence. So if you're going to use the Microsoft migration tool to migrate those over, you need to do one of two things. Either A, make sure that your 2007 and your 2012 are using the same MDT version, or B, just go ahead and remove those MDT task sequence steps from your task sequence before you migrate them. And then once it's up on 2012, just go ahead and recreate the package. We ended up going with the latter in our scenario. Do you want to talk about?
Oh yeah, and so in the servers, when I was going through that process to import my task sequence, I went through and got all the obvious ones, but things still failed, and so I actually had to go to the log file to take a look at that. You can check out this the MIG mctl.log, and it'll show you the migration status of everything that you're migrating. So it was pretty easy to go in there and find out that I had some server roles like SNMP and IIS and .NET that I needed to remove, and then migrate it, and then add those back.
Yeah. Another thing that we found when we migrated using the tool is for task sequences that were migrated over, there's a checkbox that doesn't get checked that is typically there by default when you create a new task sequence. This suppress task sequence notifications. When you migrate a task sequence, this is unchecked. If you were to just go into the Config Manager 2012 console and create a task sequence, it's automatically checked. So it may not be a big deal for a lot of your environments, but since we're very self-service, like we talked about, we didn't want those users to get a notification in the system tray to pop up every time we implemented a new image. So this is definitely something we wanted to make sure with every task sequence that we migrated, we went ahead and went back in and checked this checkbox.
Right. The only pop-up our users currently get is for the security patches.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing is this MIG mctl log. This is the master log for the migration tool. You know, if for some reason something fails or a piece doesn't execute, this is the first place you want to go to try to find out where that error exists. You know, was it a specific package? Was it a task sequence? Was it a myriad of other things? But bottom line, go and check that log if you do run into an error. Other thing is, you know, for your migration, this is pretty much goes without saying, but you know, if you have a direct dependency or reliance on third-party hardware or software solutions, extensions for your console, you probably want to make sure that those are compliant with 2012 before moving forward. Typically, a lot of software and hardware vendors, they're going to make their tools compliant with Config Manager, typically what? 30, 60, RTM plus 30, RTM plus 60, 90. So if you have a direct reliance on those, you want to make sure that you're checking with your vendors to see when they're going to have those available. Next thing, the boot images. The migration tool does not migrate boot images at all. So just keep in mind, put this in as part of your plan. You're going to have to recreate all of your boot images in 2012. Also, since it doesn't migrate the boot images, it's not going to have any of the customizations that you may have had in your boot image. So make sure that you're including that as part of your plan as well. The next piece is the Config Manager client doesn't install, of course. You know, you've got a new version. When you run the migration tool yes, it's going to create a new Config Manager client install and reference that in the task sequences that you migrate over. The key to remember, though, is if you're doing something custom in your Config Manager client install, you're going to want to migrate those pieces over because it's using a completely different package. Think of those scenarios where maybe you're using a hotfix variable to go ahead and patch your client or something of that like. Just make sure that you're including that as well. Next thing is a cool feature of Config Manager 2012. So they now have the ability that when I migrate, and in fact really it works for any task sequence, but you can actually do a right-click and send to all DPs. What does this mean? Well, in essence, what this allows you to do is, okay, I've migrated a task sequence over. It's got all these references to packages. What I can now do, instead of actually looking for each package that's referenced, making sure it's out on the DP, I can actually go into my task sequence, right-click, say distribute content to all DPs, and it's going to send every package associated with that task sequence out to the DPs. So definitely a cool little feature. I mean, I think we've all been in that scenario where you get the package blah, 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 could not be, isn't on your distribution point. This is going to give you a much easier method to make sure that those are out on the DPs. And then the last thing is the DP groups. We all know that we had DP groups in 2007, but with 2012, they put in a cool little feature where if you deploy content to a distribution group, for instance, we use a OSD-only distro DP group. what we can now do with Config Manager 2012 is actually monitor the status messages just for those DPs when I'm distributing the content. So, you know, I just sent out a new version of JRE, and I want to be able to just monitor those DP groups. It gives you an easier method to go ahead and pull that type of information through. Yep. Did I forget anything, Mark?
I think that's it.
Okay, and with that, that's all that we have for today. Make sure you guys complete your surveys. If you guys have any questions, we can come up to the mic, or if you guys want to grab one of us afterwards, feel free to. And thank you for your time.